like to have Norm give a short introduction to Class 8, which is on justice-based leadership, justice-based management, and justice-based governance. And I'll be making a presentation on that today, but we'd like Norm to open it up.
Well, thank you, Dawn. Well, it comes down to this. It comes down to the fact that either you have leadership at the top telling everybody what to do, or leadership who are teaching justice. And that's what we're trying to do. Leadership is not for themselves, but rather to help people learn principles, and Dawn will go into that, in order to provide equal justice for every human being in the world. And in order to do that, as you know, we have to look at the economic system. And Kelso and Bucky Fuller and others developed a way of looking at the economic system so that it could be available to every person. So let me now turn, and Dawn is going to make the presentation today. So Dawn, it's yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to bring up some slides now. So again, this is Class 8 of Justice University, and we're going to be talking about a system for incorporating the principles of economic justice at the level of a company or organization. So this is at the micro level versus what we've been talking about largely is how you apply the principles of economic and social justice throughout an economy and throughout the world. So that from the policy standpoint. Now we're going to look a little bit more at the ground level. And again, this is an application of the just third way paradigm at the microeconomic level. And that's where you're dealing with human beings and interactions of human beings. So we start with the problem facing the corporation today, the modern business corporation, which is the predominant form for producing most of our goods and services. Even though there are many sole proprietorships, the form of the corporation is extremely useful as a tool, a social tool, for bringing together labor of all sorts and capital of all sorts in order to produce. And it has the added benefit of protecting its owners, the shareholders, from personal liability if the company goes under or doesn't pay its debts, that the corporate form protects them from having their home seized or their outside wealth seized. So it does help accelerate and make more efficient the processes of producing, particularly for a global marketplace, but even at a local level. So today, and this is reflected in all the statistics for concentration of not only income, but especially wealth, productive wealth. And this is a statistic from 2012, and it stayed pretty much the same, but in some ways it's become more concentrated. Here we show, this was Edward Wolff at New York University, is well known for his studies of wealth concentration. And at that point, he was finding that 10% of the population own 90% or more of corporate equity. There are other forms, but looking at corporate equity. And so you have 90% of the rest of us sharing in that 10% slice. So today you'll find that even among the 10%, it's really not just the top 1%, but the top 1% of 1% who own the really a sizable majority of productive wealth in terms of corporate shares. So we can see all the harms that that brings about when you have such concentrated ownership and concentrated power. But the question is, looking towards the future, who will own that corporate equity? because we're talking about things, corporations and their wealth and their capital that don't exist today. We're talking about the production of future goods and services to be sold. And so if we know who is going to be owning in the future, we're going to know who will have power in the future. And as power follows property, we see that if we want to make sure that power is spread out, we have to ensure that future ownership is where we have to concentrate. And that, of course, is where the money and financing comes into play, because it's those who have access to money for future investments who will own in the future and therefore will control. So the just third way is looking at how we protect property rights of existing shareholders, but grow the corporation so that every person, including those who are super wealthy today, will have equal access to new money, new asset-backed money, and interest-free credit to purchase corporate shares. So we're looking towards now expanding the pie versus trying to take away from the existing pie to redistribute. We also see in the corporation, and this is pretty typical of what's happening in society, is this fracturing, this dividing of people, pulling it away from each other. And so this has had a tremendous impact on the corporation and its ability to produce efficiently and in such a way that you increase the distribution of purchasing power as you grow the corporation. So it's leading to all these different stakeholders wanting their own share and not having any common ground to help prosper together. So we call this the conflict model or zero-sum game of industrial relations, meaning if it's the assumption that in order for me to gain, you have to lose. And what the just third way offers is a win-win approach, which is, there's a word called synergy, which means when you have all the pieces working together in a coordinated way, you end up with a greater result than just the sum of each of its parts. All the little pieces itself, you end up with more. So that is where we have people with a shared interest in making the corporation successful, meaning profitable and competitive, and we would say sustainable. That ends up benefiting all the stakeholders, including government, because that's where the source of its taxes is going to come from, is from a prosperous citizens. So what we're looking at is how do you transform the corporation from its present form and its present problems to one which is more unified and more justice oriented. And we look at what we call the wage system, wage welfare system, which is assuming that the only way most people will get their income is from their wages and salaries. And the way to prosper is to get more wages and salaries each year. And regardless of whether the individual's producing more or contributing more to the growth of the corporation, the earnings. So you have what Norm, in one of his many life stories, describes as the pyramid form of the wage system corporation, where you have the pharaoh at the top and everyone at the bottom serving the pharaoh. And we see that in this typical system, you have monopolization of power at the top, and generally there's going to be control through fear, and that's within the corporation. It's the fear of losing your job, among other things, but that's the big controlling factor that many people, it ties them to the company, or it keeps them silent when they are aware of a problem. And it, of course, is reflected in the ownership. It's very concentrated. Control is concentrated. At best, you have benevolent paternalism. You know, it's generosity, giving people, maybe raising or paying out a bonus because you had a good month and we're going to just, we feel good, we're going to give you something extra, but there's no sharing of power. And accountability, it's everyone is accountable to the leader, but the leader is not accountable to anyone else. And the incentives, again, are, it's really the distribution of rewards from those who have to those who don't have. And it also is reflected in how rewards and pay increases are often totally disconnected from whether there's actual profits being generated, which is, if you can see on Wall Street, when the prices of shares go up, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the soundness of the company. And so this leads to a lot of waste within the corporation, and even to the point where there's theft, there's people quit. People don't have a real stake in the companies they work for. And so this is everything at this point, unless you're an owner, you're going to be worrying about your income security, and that will tend to keep you quiet when someone may need to speak up. And as a result of that, the corporation has become the target of political attacks, where people, for example, on the left view the corporation itself as an evil entity that is controlling the world. The corporations are controlling everything, and they lose the sense of the corporation is only a social tool. It is owned by human beings, and those human beings at this time have access to the means to continue their ownership and control over this very powerful social institution. So without getting too much into the details of the justice-based ownership approach, justice-based management, leadership, and governance, it flips that pyramid on its head so that we would have the leader at the bottom here, the servant teacher leader, whose role is to teach and help people internalize principles of justice, economic justice, so that it becomes part of their daily habits. It's the way the business operates. So every level of the corporation, starting from the, let's say, the leader of the company, and then you have generally a core team, leadership team, which may be made up of people from many parts of the company, and then each level, middle management, until you get to the frontline workers who are dealing directly with customers. And what unites them is the idea of delivering the highest value to the customer and empowering every person at every level to do this. And if they do this well, they will succeed in the marketplace. So all these things, everything has to now be consistent and reflect this common interest of every person. And we'll get into more how this reflects in the corporation and the structure of the enterprise. But at all aspects of a company, you would look at, is this reflecting the principles of economic justice? So this also says, if we're going to talk about economic justice at the level of the corporation, we must ensure that every person has equal opportunity to become an owner and equal access of every person, no matter what their position in the company is. Whether they're the janitor or the CEO, they must have equal access to the means of acquiring and owning productive capital. So I'll talk about a little bit later in terms of an employee-owned company using an employee stock ownership plan, how we would view the structuring of this, so that as the corporation finances its growth and it's not using anyone's personal savings, then the social means of money and credit newly created should be extended equally to every person. Your labor inputs, how that's valued in the marketplace, is another matter. But in terms of pure future capital ownership opportunity, it should be equal. And secondly, we have to remember that if we don't respect private property as a universal principle and respect the private property rights of others, including existing shareholders, then that negates the validity of property rights for ourselves. So this is something that must be built into the system so that no one is ever deprived of their rights or the wealth. And again, as we look at how do we start structuring this in the corporation, we have to start with each person, each human person, the importance of each person, the dignity and empowerment of each person. And in the economic sphere, that means economic empowerment, which it's basically translates into no one should have control over your stomach or my stomach, that we must have the means to sustain ourselves and our families. And again, if we're going to transform the corporation from a wage system social tool to an ownership system tool, we have to look at how growth is financed. And that will start with the creation of new money, asset-backed money, which in terms of what the business is getting a loan or someone is getting a loan in order to become an owner in the shares of the company. So it's how we democratize access to insured capital credit. So this is at the level of the corporation and those who are going to own the shares in the corporation. They need to have access to insured capital credit. And it requires that rather than forcing people with no savings to repay loans, you create that automatic repayment through the corporation's profits. So as new capital is added and new goods and services are sold, that becomes the source of capital loan repayment. And of course, we bring in the idea of insurance because life is not perfect. And occasionally something will happen so that the loan isn't repaid, but that's where insurance comes into play. And now we're going to look at how the three principles of the Kelso-Adler theory of economic justice, which now includes, we would say, Father Foury's concept of social justice, how they can come in to the design of the corporation and its systems. So we're going to look at in the corporation is participative justice being applied, and that is determining in a free market basis what your labor input is going to be worth, and that is subject to variations in pay for a labor contribution. But what you contribute, you should be rewarded for, and that's the distributive justice. Similarly, with input from capital, if we're talking now about capital that isn't originally contributed, but now capital that's going to be acquired with insured capital credit, so no one's putting in their own money, then we want to equalize that opportunity, which means with the distribution of profits or dividends, that will end up being distributed according to the distribution of shares. And in this case, it would be equally. And because we know that no system, no human creation is perfect, we have to always be on the lookout for problems that are about to occur. So accountability and transparency are very essential in a justice-based managed corporation. And so that has to do with information and the distribution of that information and enabling people to understand what the information means, and then have mechanisms where if something is going wrong, there's a way to repair it. So ideally, if you have a justice-based corporation, you have the mechanisms in place so you don't have to go through a potential crisis that could kill the company. You have built into the structure a way of detecting and correcting. And again, this it's essential that we recognize what the rights of private property mean in terms of a shareholder and the equity that a shareholder has. And that, as we remember from previous sessions, has to do with the right of an owner to the full fruits of what his or her capital produces. And we have that mechanism of shares to help us put a number on that. What is our proportionate due? And then also, as an owner, you should have the right of control over what you own, and that translates into the vote, a shareholder vote. Now, how that vote, how broadly that extends beyond the essential right to be able to vote for your representative on the board, it can also extend to certain issues where you want a direct vote from the people who own. But generally, just for efficiency's sake, you want to enable people to elect members of the board who represent, that they feel confidence in, who will be overseeing the interests of those shareholders. So there are different ways to structure the control of governance in a company, but it must reflect those basic principles of private property. So again, in the big context as well as the small context, we face this enormous challenge of shifting from a wage welfare system to an ownership system. And just speaking from personal experience, as our professional company, as we installed employee stock ownership plans that we lasted for many, many years. And what we noticed in one example, it was originally a company owned by a husband and wife who started just with a truck, and they built up a plywood business for builders, and they gradually brought in more people into the company. They were very generous people. They started with allowing their workers, whoever could afford it, to buy shares, and they instituted an excellent profit sharing plan. It was the husband was an engineer, so he worked out something that was simple and brilliant, and it was essentially to teach people, what creates profits. So identifying the bottom line and then knowing what profits were available, and based on a formula, not arbitrarily, based on a formula, people in the company would know how much they would share in profits. So they had built up a very successful system before they even introduced the ESOP, which became a way that the owners could sell out the company to their employees. And we were consulting with them for at least 2 decades or more. And what happens is that the outside culture sends signals, and you are constantly, there's a turnover of people work in the company, a change in leadership and management. And if the attitudes of the outside world, which are wage welfare system, start putting pressure on even the best of broadly owned justice-based management companies, that becomes it is a challenge. And so you see that we have to change the macro system as well as inside a company. But those companies which do use an ownership system approach tend to outcompete similar companies without it. So this becomes, I would say, the hardest part of turning a company into a worker owned, or it may be worker customer owned, is that you have existing wage system attitudes, and you've got to now change the attitudes, that's part of the culture. It's the actual human interactions and beliefs and traditions and mythology and what people believe and how they act, which is different than purely, the legal construct of a company, what's on paper. This is what is really how it's being lived. So again, culture is the shared beliefs, values, attitudes, behaviors, customs, arts, and social institutions of a particular nation, people, or social group. So you can see our present culture today in America is not a justice-based ownership society or system, but that's what, through processes of social justice at different levels of the common good, we can start to change. So then the question is, how do we create this new culture of shared equity and responsibility? And in the actual process, if we're starting from scratch, we first have to identify our shared moral values, our shared understanding of justice. We need to have a shared vision. Now, we all have different values relating to things like taste in clothes or preference in color, whatever it might be. But we're now talking about such things as, do we agree on justice? Do we agree on truth? Do we agree on this idea of equal opportunity? And that's very important, that the group is very firmly committed to these shared values. In CESJ, we talk about truth, beauty, love, and justice as absolute values, which simply means that while we may not understand them fully or grasp them or able to even understand them, we have this faith that they exist, and that's what we're constantly working towards, is to understand and implement them more fully. Then you need a shared vision. We need to have something that keeps us moving in the same direction. If some people are still thinking in the old wage system approach, they're going to have a vision that may be more tending towards concentrating ownership at the top. And so maybe some of the company are thinking this way, and the rest are thinking, no, we want to move to a justice-based shared ownership system. So they're going to have a different vision. And if you are pulling against each other, really no side is going to win. But you certainly can't make that transformation. And then you have to have a strategy that this evolves over time, and there may be shifts as certain circumstances occur, but everyone in the company has to understand where we are moving as a group, and that we're going to move together in a certain way. And justice-based management is, and I would say leadership and governance are all starting with this notion of, how do you structure the diffusion of power? Because power does tend to concentrate, and it tends to concentrate at the top and with those who own more. So what is it, rather than leaving this up to chance or benevolence, we need to look at how the underlying structure of our institutions, in this case, the corporation, make sure there are always checks and balances, make sure that equal opportunity is always systematically spread out in our policies, how we do things, how we grow, how we finance our growth. So justice-based management was really the core concept that we started with, and that is coming up with a management or organizational system for transforming the business corporation. And here you see the human person, and you see the scales of justice. So that's to remind us that we want to be always thinking about, what is the place of the human person in our company, whether it could be the workers, it could be customers, but we want to treat everyone with justice. And one of the essential concepts is leadership, because in any endeavor where you have more than one person, you're going to need to have some impetus and leadership. And leadership may flow and change depending on the needs of the organization. Or, for example, certainly during World War II, you had Winston Churchill, who was the right man for leading Great Britain through that horrible war. Afterwards, he was maybe not the leader in order to move forward, but in any case, people then look towards a different type of leadership. But essentially, you always want to have leaders who are fixated, focused on justice as a guiding principle. And what this sort of leader, as opposed to the top-down dominating leader, serves, teaches, and empowers others. That's, at least they are constantly striving to do that. And in terms of how this affects the competitiveness and profitability of companies, there have been many studies over the years. One was by Professor Alan Blinder, who wrote a book called Paying for Productivity. You've had studies done by a number of universities, which find that other things being equal, if you have two companies that are in the same industry, same size, etc., but one has certain elements, those we would say the elements of an ownership culture, they tend to outperform the other company by 150% in terms of profitability. And so the three keys that these studies found were essential in terms of really affecting the productiveness of people and the effectiveness of the corporation is they had to have some form of long-term equity sharing so that people have a long-term stake in the growth of the company. And then they also needed to have, because people can't think constantly in terms of 20 years downstream, they're living, week to week, day to day, week to week, year to year. And unless you get some kind of feedback as to how the company is doing and it has some impact on you, then it's very hard to start changing people's attitudes and behaviors. So they found that frequent financial uh, feedback in terms of information sharing and the education, but then especially the sharing of rewards in the form of profits, coming out of profits, that this was essential to keep people kind of interested and in the game and feeling either, for example, going back to the company I was mentioning before, Allied Plywood, even the truck drivers knew when they were having a good month. They knew where they've hit break even, and they knew they'd share in a certain percentage of the profits. So if that bottom line, if you didn't hit break even, you weren't going to get a bonus. And in some months, you had truck drivers receiving 3 times more out of these financial rewards, the profit-based rewards, than out of their own pay. So they had a personal reason to make sure the company did well. And this showed in their behavior when just a truck driver, I guess, delivering plywood for one site, they drive past a construction site and they'd step out and they'd give a business card to whoever the foreman is saying, check out our products. So now they're not salespeople, but they felt a personal reason to help the sales of the company and also to keep the costs down as well. So they tended to keep their pay on the modest side of the market rate. So they weren't just automatically raising salaries and wages every year. So then the third thing is that people need to feel that they're more than just a cog, just a tool. They want to feel that they are participants in the functioning of the company, that they have some kind of dignity and positive contributions. So the idea of participatory management takes many different forms, and it's really it's going to be must be tailored to the specific company, what will be appropriate. But it reflects Father Ferree's idea of subsidiarity, or I should say this is in uh, uh, the social encyclicals and Catholic social teaching, for example, that the notion of subsidiarity, that you get power down to the appropriate level, which may mean down to the frontline worker, but there's also a place for the levels above, where power and decision making should be. So that again is an art, but the idea is to put power where the immediate decision making needs to be. So when you have these 3 elements, that translates into a more competitive and profitable company. So we took those notions and we look at what are the most, what are the common elements of a business corporation, and what areas do we need to be aware of in order to bring that transformation to an ownership system. So we look at, are people aware of and can they articulate a set of core values, what their company vision is, and what the strategic plan is in general. And in most companies, no, they either don't have shared core values, and the vision is one person's vision, and the strategic plan is something that management keeps close to the vest. So this has to change. If you want people engaged and to have a personal stake, they have to be part of that. And it starts with an articulation by the leader. And this is typically because the leader has that responsibility of looking over the entire organization, looking at the macro level of the organization. So that person will, it's more in line with what they do, that they will have be able to clearly define or give that person's understanding of that. And what we took this, then built upon this, you take this process through all levels of the company so that every person has a chance to hear and listen and make recommendations, et cetera, to develop a statement that everyone feels that they had a part in creating. Then we look at, in terms of the ownership opportunity, this is something this is fairly recent that now I'm talking about Equity Expansion International, our professional company. We decided that we're not going to do typical ESOPs, which allocate shares based on people's proportionate pay. So meaning the CEO would get more shares than the janitor. But then we said, if we're doing ESOPs where the money is all raised, that it's not anyone's personal savings, then there's really no justification for that. If we're really thinking in terms of equal human dignity and in terms of equal input, well, this is not a personal input in terms of savings. So we will only do equal allocation ESOPs. And that just means every year when shares are contributed to every person's account, that it would be an equal number of shares. And so over time, you have new people coming in, and they'll obviously have fewer shares, but they will share equally in that any particular year's allocations. We also look at the pay and reward system. We want to make sure that it is reinforcing that concept of economic justice, that you should be rewarded based on your contributions. So this can take many different forms, whether we look at monthly bonuses are very important, but also annual rewards if we want to recognize special effort or special contribution by an individual. So we look at the feedback systems, and again, profit sharing. This is a mistake many companies make, and it's the percentage or the amount that's being distributed as profit sharing tends to be arbitrary. Management says, well, we had a good month, we'll be generous. Then another month, maybe, well, for whatever reason, we're not going to pay out profits. And so there's no sense of regularity or that this is an objective system. And that's why it's important to have a formula which tells people, if we earn this much, if we've hit break even, this is a percentage we're going to get to share in terms of the profits, whether it's low or it's high. Then again, participatory management systems. And this is usually at the level of each area of the company, whether it's the production line or the sales line, and people are aware of problems that are occurring. The frontline workers are often the first to know. And if management isn't listening to them, then you're going to have bigger problems occurring. And then finally, the governance and accountability structures. This has to do with how the board of directors will hire management and what policies will be instituted. And then always making sure that there's transparency and accountability. And again, we can look even more, even in terms of our hiring policies. If there's grievances, how do we handle those so they're addressed, they're not swept under the rug? All of this requires ongoing communications and education and information sharing, and leadership development. So once you start, it's not a one-time thing. So that has to become part of this structure in the corporation as well. And then you look at, well, what's going to happen when this generation of leaders in management gets ready to retire? What is the succession plan? How are we perhaps going to finance growth in the future, or maybe purchasing of the remaining shares of the original owner? So all of this, you start planning ahead of time. It's good for all of us to do that. It's not easy to do. And justice-based governance, we look at the structuring of a board, and we want to make sure that we don't leave the power in the board in just management. And there's a story that's on our website on South Bend Lathe, and this is Norm can relate that story at another time, but it was a historic event that he was largely the architect of, which was to create the world's first 100% leveraged buyout by all the employees of a company, which means it was all borrowing in order to save a company that was about to be liquidated. So this was just a remarkable story in and of itself. And Norm, for the first time, also built in the idea of voting on the shares, which unfortunately many ESOP companies try and avoid that. So they maybe deal with the financial side, but not the voting side. So Norm instituted another innovation. Well, it really was justice-based structuring of the vote. And what happened was, it was a real quirk in terms of, and I don't want to get too much into detail, but it had to do with how the shares were being repaid and who had control over shares that weren't yet paid for. And it just so happened it ended up being more in the management hands. And so we learned through difficult experience that you have to look at a fair structuring of the board. We would recommend that a third is management, a third is non-management, and then the other third should be outside board members who both management and non-management agree to. And also in the governance, you can't have a company operating like, a town hall where every decision is voted on. Your business will come to a standstill. So you have to weigh how decisions are made without making the company inoperable or diluting the ownership rights of existing shareholders. So those are issues we look at. And then we came up with the idea of ownership unions to transform labor unions, which are now really mechanisms of the wage system. And we have an example with Walter Reuther, who Norm had the opportunity to work, I guess, under with the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty. But he was the president of the United Auto Workers, very powerful guy. And he heard about Kelso's thinking. He was already thinking somewhat along the lines of profit sharing, but he testified before the Joint Economic Committee saying that if workers could get their gains through profit sharing and ownership sharing, this would enable US companies to be more competitive because they wouldn't have to raise their fixed costs. And so he was a visionary, and if the rest of the labor movement had listened to him, I think we'd be in a different position than we are today. And then we're looking at also now the unions have to shift from wage system orientation to ownerships thinking, so that their membership could be vastly larger than it is today. Labor unions are losing membership except in public sector unions, but now they could represent all owners, including the new owners to be created through the Economic Democracy Act. And they can help in teaching, educating, training people in ownership. So that's one of the goals is, and we want to get to leaders in the labor unions to start presenting these ideas to them, because they could be a very powerful political force to help get the Economic Democracy Act enacted. And again, this is the social justice component of justice-based management. Governance leadership is the idea of there's always going to be the need for fixing and improving your systems, because they may be very effective at present, but something happens. Maybe there's an innovation in your industry and it throws a monkey wrench into the works, and we have to rethink things, or the economy is going through a decline. What do we do about that? How do we make sure our company can survive? So that notion of continuous system improvement is essential. So then we look here at what we call the active social justice, which is the art of change in a justice-based managed company. And we've run through this, and this is something that can be used to bring about change at any level of society or the common good, whether it's at the policy level, the institutional level, meaning, let's say, within tax laws, or more importantly, our monetary laws, perceiving that there's something wrong with it. Someone or a number of people will start to see it, and it just, can't leave it alone. So then you get to, okay, you have to find other people who want to change the system, because you can't, as an individual, you can't change a system. It is by nature a social tool, and it needs social organization among people to correct it. So then you decide formally to create a group, or in a justice-based managed company, there may be a group of people who see that there's something drastically wrong, and they have to figure out, this is not a one-time problem. This has been going on over and over. So what do we do? So then they're going to come together. They're going to educate each other about, okay, we all agree there's a problem. We want to fix it in a certain way. We don't want to make the problem worse. We're going to approach the solving of this problem in a particular way. So then we have to be very clear on what is the problem, diagnosing it accurately. In a company, you better have numbers to back up. If you're going to propose a change, you need to show, in terms of the costs and the benefits, and whatever. When you make a presentation to management in particular, you define the problem very succinctly, so it's clear in people's minds, what needs to be changed. You formulate a solution to this that is justice-based. Then you have to start, okay, what specifically do we do? So the action planning gets even more specific. And then as you start to act on this, you got to bring more people in to this effort to correct the system. You want it to grow till the point where, okay, it's going to happen. There's the resistance that you're going to just naturally have from human inertia. You overcome that with enough educated, focused people who are supporting the change. And then that helps the change actually be introduced. And then after that, you want to make sure your corrections did what they were supposed to. So evaluation of the results and maybe fine tune. And then we want to make sure this is going to be part of our culture. So this is something that people have to internalize. It also has to be built into the formal legal structure of the corporation, so that it just doesn't get forgotten, but it's something now it's part of our institution. And everything's going just perfectly until it doesn't, and someone perceives a malfunction or injustice. So that is essentially the cycle of the active social justice. And it recognizes that none of us are perfect and none of our institutions are perfect. But if we're guided by the right principles, we can keep moving in the right direction.